Who are you? The vampire king hissed, and why are you weeping at my wife's grave? Ravina was just a penniless stranger. She had never met Queen Lyra. She had never set foot in this cemetery. But as she knelt in the mist, paralyzed by a grief that didn't belong to her, the king didn't kill her for trespassing. He froze, because the tears on her face were for a woman dead 500 years, but the glowing mark hidden in her hands proved she was the only one who could bring the queen back. If you're already hooked and ready for this tale of ancient love, dark secrets, and impossible destiny, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The ancient gloom of Shadowmere Cemetery clung to the air like a funeral shroud, tasting of iron and midnight blossoms, as if the very ground mourned a loss 500 years old. Skeletal trees twisted overhead, their bare branches clawing at a bruised twilight sky. Carved stone angels stood sentinel along the winding paths, their faces worn smooth by centuries of rain, their blank eyes watching nothing and everything. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed afraid to disturb this place. Ravina Coldmere knelt alone before Queen Lyra's memorial crypt, her knees pressed against the frost-hardened earth. The structure towered above her, massive, imposing, carved from black marble veined with silver that caught what little light remained. Ancient symbols spiraled across its surface, letters in a language she'd never learned but somehow recognized in the deepest chambers of her heart. Gargoyles crouched at each corner, their mouths open in eternal, silent screams. Her threadbare coat, patched at the elbows and missing 2 buttons, hung loose around her thin frame. The cold bit through the worn fabric, but she barely noticed. Her dark hair, tangled from days without proper shelter, fell across her face as she hunched forward, one trembling hand reaching out to brush away the dead leaves that had gathered at the crypt's base. She did it carefully, tenderly, as if she were tending to someone she had known her entire life. Tears carved warm tracks down her frost-pinched cheeks, and her lips moved in a whisper too broken to hear clearly. An apology, perhaps. Or a confession. Her canvas bag lay forgotten beside her, its contents spilling slightly, a crust of bread wrapped in cloth, a battered tin cup, the few copper coins that represented everything she owned in the world. But none of that mattered now, because the grief that crashed through her chest was not her own. It was too vast, too ancient, too bone-deep to belong to a 23-year-old woman who had never set foot in this cemetery before today. Yet she knew this place. She knew the exact path through the labyrinth of tombs. She knew the 12 steps from the iron gate. She knew the pattern of cracks in the marble beneath her knees. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she had been here before, even though that was impossible. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the stone, her voice raw. "I don't know why I couldn't save you. I don't know why I failed." The words didn't make sense. They never did. But they poured from her lips like a ritual she'd performed 1,000 times in dreams that had haunted her since childhood. Behind her, a sound. Footsteps. Deliberate. Unhurried. Echoing across the stone path like the ticking of an ancient clock. Ravina's breath caught, but she didn't turn. She couldn't. Her body had gone rigid, every instinct screaming danger, yet she remained frozen, her hand still pressed against the cold marble. A figure emerged from the mist that seemed to gather and bow in his presence. He was impossibly tall, his long black coat embroidered with silver thread that caught the dying light like captured starlight. His hair fell past his shoulders in waves of pure white, not the white of age, but the white of moonlight on snow, of things that had never known the warmth of the sun. In one hand, he carried a single black rose, its petals so dark they seemed to drink the shadows. When he stopped just behind her, Ravina could feel the cold radiating from him like winter given form. His voice, when it came, was low and smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of centuries, of power barely contained, of grief that had calcified into something harder than stone. "Who are you, mortal?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Then, quieter, with an edge that could cut deeper than any knife. "That is my wife's tomb." Ravina gasped, her head snapping around. Her wide eyes found him, this impossible man who stood too still, who breathed too little, whose crimson eyes gleamed in the gathering dark like embers in a dying fire. She scrambled partway to her feet, nearly losing her balance, her hand instinctively reaching for the crypt's edge to steady herself. I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone. I wasn't trying to." Her voice caught in her throat. Because when their eyes met, something inside her recognized him. Knew him. The way she knew the path. The way she knew the tomb. The way she knew the grief that was destroying her from the inside out. King Thalric Nightfall stood motionless, the black rose still held in one pale hand. His expression was carved from ice, distant, regal, utterly controlled. But something flickered behind those crimson eyes. Something that looked, for just a heartbeat, like shock. His gaze dropped to her right hand, still pressed against the marble. And there, glowing faintly in the darkness like starlight beneath her skin, was a mark she'd carried since birth. A symbol she'd always hidden beneath gloves and long sleeves, convinced it was nothing more than an ugly birthmark. But Thalric knew that mark. He had last seen it 500 years ago, burned into the palm of the only woman he had ever loved. The sigil of the royal house of Nightfall. His voice, when he spoke again, was barely above a whisper, and for the first time in half a millennium, it trembled. "Show me your hand." Ravina's heart thundered in her chest. She should run. Every survival instinct she'd honed through years of poverty and danger screamed at her to flee. But instead, slowly, she extended her right hand toward him. The mark blazed brighter in the darkness. Thalric's breath, though he had no need to breathe, hitched audibly. He took one step closer, then another, until he stood directly before her. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The truth was written in light and shadow between them. "You carry her essence," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded dangerously close to hope. "You carry my queen soul." Ravina shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "I don't understand. I don't know what that means. I've never even heard of Queen Lyra until you dreamed of her," Thalric finished, his eyes never leaving the mark on her hand. "Until you saw her memories as if they were your own. Until her grief became yours." Ravina's legs gave out. She sank back to her knees, trembling violently. "How do you know that?" Thalric finally looked away from her hand to her face, this poor, desperate, mortal girl who should mean nothing to him. But the soul fragment she carried changed everything. Because 500 years ago, he said quietly, on the night she was murdered, "My queen performed a forbidden act. She shattered her soul to save my life. And you," his voice broke, just slightly, "you are a piece of her." The fog thickened around them, as if the cemetery itself were leaning in to listen. Ravina stared up at him, this vampire king whose grief had outlived empires, and whispered the question that would change both their destinies forever. "Why can I feel her dying in my dreams?" Thalric's expression hardened, his hand tightening around the stem of the black rose until a thorn pierced his palm. Dark blood welled, then vanished as his flesh healed instantly. "Because," he said, his voice cold and final as a winter grave, "there are those who want to ensure she and the curse she broke stays dead forever." Behind them, in the shadows between the tombs, something moved. And for the first time in 5 centuries, King Thalric Nightfall felt the sharp, unfamiliar sting of fear. Not for himself, but for the fragile, mortal girl who carried the last fragment of the woman he had loved. Ravina now knows the impossible truth, but the Crimson Cabal is closing in, and neither she nor Thalric understands the full cost of Queen Lyra's sacrifice. What will happen when the past's darkest secrets come to light? Drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. The descent into the catacombs beneath the citadel felt like traveling backward through time itself. Ravina followed Thalric down spiraling stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that were not hers, yet felt familiar beneath her worn boots. Torches blazed to life as they passed, their flames burning blue-white and cold, casting no warmth, only light that made the shadows dance like living things. Thalric moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his white hair catching the ghostly illumination. He had not spoken since they entered the citadel an hour ago, his jaw set in a hard line, his crimson eyes fixed ahead. But Ravina could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge, centuries of grief and hope and fear compressed into this singular moment. They stopped before a door that shouldn't exist. The wall appeared solid, unbroken black stone veined with silver that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat trapped in rock. But as Thalric raised one pale hand, ancient symbols blazed to life across the surface, spiraling outward in patterns that made Ravina's head spin and her mark burn beneath her skin. 500 years, Thalric said quietly, his voice echoing in the vast silence. This chamber has remained sealed since the night she died. No magic I possess can open it. No key exists. He turned to her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. Except you. Ravina's hand trembled as she raised it toward the stone. The mark on her palm blazed brighter, silver-white light spilling between her fingers. The moment her skin touched the wall, the world shifted. The stone melted away like morning mist. Beyond lay a chamber carved entirely from crystal that reflected light in 1,000 impossible directions. At its center stood a tomb of pure white marble, untouched by age or decay, its surface engraved with words that glowed softly in a language Ravina suddenly, impossibly understood. Here lies not a body, but a promise. Here rests not death, but transformation. Thalric stood frozen at the threshold, as if crossing it would shatter him completely. Ravina stepped inside alone. The air hummed with power that made her bones vibrate and her soul ache with recognition. Floating above the tomb, suspended in shimmering light, were words, a prophecy written in fire and starlight that burned themselves into her mind the moment she read them. The blood oath cannot be broken by a mortal hand, for it feeds on eternal essence. Only through division and reunion, only through the merged will of fragmented soul and mortal heart, can the curse be unmade. The queen has chosen sacrifice. The shards must choose love. Ravina reached toward the floating words, and the world exploded into memory. She was no longer herself. She was Lyra, beautiful, powerful, dying. Her body lay broken on cold stone, assassin's poison burning through her veins, but that pain was nothing compared to what she was about to do. Thalric knelt beside her, his face twisted in agony, the blood oath curse draining his immortal life faster than the poison drained hers. No, he begged, his voice shattered. Don't leave me. Please. But Lyra smiled through her tears, her hand glowing with forbidden magic. I'm not leaving you, my love. I'm giving you a future. The pain of soul-shattering was beyond description. It was being torn apart at the seams of existence itself, fragmenting into pieces that screamed across time and space, scattering into vessels not yet born. The assassination hadn't killed her, this act of supreme love had. And as her soul broke, so too did the curse's hold on Thalric's immortal essence. Ravina gasped, slamming back into her own body, tears streaming down her face. She understood now. Everything. The dreams. The grief. The impossible pull to this place. She turned to find Thalric standing just inside the chamber, his face pale even for a vampire, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that could have burned worlds. She loved you so much, Ravina whispered, her voice breaking, that she destroyed herself to save you. Thalric's control finally shattered. He sank to his knees before the tomb, 5 centuries of restrained grief pouring from him in a sound too raw to be called weeping. And Ravina, who carried a fragment of the queen who had made this impossible sacrifice, knelt beside the king who had mourned alone for half a millennium, and placed her marked hand gently on his shoulder. Neither of them saw the shadow that flickered at the chamber's entrance. Neither heard the whisper of ancient magic being unraveled. The Crimson Cabal had found them. Ravina has discovered the terrible truth of Queen Lyra's sacrifice, but now the Crimson Cabal has her in their sights. Do you think King Thalric will find her in time, or will his centuries of mourning blind him to what truly matters? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The attack came at midnight, when even darkness held its breath. The Citadel's ancient wards shattered like glass, their protective magic unraveling in a cascade of sparks that rained down from the vaulted ceilings. The explosion threw Ravina from her bed in the guest chamber, her body slamming against cold stone as the walls trembled and groaned. Screams echoed through the corridors, human and inhuman alike, and beneath it all, a sound like thunder rolled through the foundation itself. The Crimson Cabal had come. Ravina scrambled to her feet, her marked hand blazing with silver light that illuminated the chaos beyond her shattered door. Figures in crimson cloaks poured through the breached eastern wall, their faces hidden behind masks carved to resemble screaming skulls. They moved with terrifying precision, cutting down Thalric's guards with blades that drank blood and left nothing but ash in their wake. "Get to the king," a commanding voice rang out through the bedlam. Lord Rhames, Thalric's ancient advisor, gray-haired and battle-scarred, appeared in her doorway, his sword already slick with dark blood. Behind him, Lady Seraphina moved like liquid shadow, her twin daggers flashing as she dispatched two assassins who had tried to flank them. Both had viewed Ravina with cold suspicion since her arrival, questioning whether she was fraud or threat. But now they fought for her with everything they had. "Move," Seraphina hissed, grabbing Ravina's arm with surprising gentleness despite the violence in her eyes. "The vault, we have to get you to." The wall exploded inward. Stone and mortar erupted in a cloud of choking dust. Through the devastation strode a figure that made even Rhames take an involuntary step backward. Commander Zarkos stood nearly 7 feet tall, his crimson armor etched with runes that pulsed with stolen life force. His face was a nightmare of burn scars and cold ambition, his eyes black as void. In his hands, he carried chains that writhed like living serpents, forged from metal that screamed when it moved. "The fragment," he said, his voice like gravel grinding against bone. "Give her to me, and I'll make your deaths quick." Rhames and Seraphina moved as one, placing themselves between Zarkos and Ravina. "Over our corpses," Rhames growled, his blade raised despite the tremor in his weathered hands. Zarkos smiled. "Acceptable." The battle was brutal and brief. Rhames fought with the skill of 1,000 years, his sword a silver blur that should have been unstoppable. Seraphina danced through the chaos like death given form, her daggers finding gaps in armor that shouldn't exist. But Zarkos was something else entirely, something twisted by dark rituals and forbidden magic that made him faster, stronger, monstrous. He caught Rhames's blade with his bare hand, shattering it with a gesture. Seraphina's dagger pierced his side, but he didn't even flinch, backhanding her into the wall with bone-crushing force. Then his void-black eyes fixed on Ravina. She ran. Through corridors she barely knew, her lungs burning, her mark blazing so bright it left trails of light in her wake. Behind her, Zarkos' footsteps echoed with the inevitability of fate itself. She could hear him laughing, a sound devoid of humanity. "You can't outrun destiny, little shard. You were always meant for our altar." The corridor ended in a dead end. Ravina spun, pressing her back against cold stone, watching as Zarkos emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. His chains uncoiled, reaching for her with terrible hunger. "Thalric," she screamed, the name tearing from her throat with every ounce of desperation she possessed. "Thalric." The chains struck like vipers, wrapping around her wrists, her throat, burning where they touched her skin. The pain was exquisite, designed to bind not just flesh but soul. Ravina collapsed to her knees, gasping, her vision blurring as Zarkos hauled her upward like a puppet on strings. "Your king is too busy mourning his dead queen to save you," Zarkos whispered against her ear. "You're nothing but her ghost. And ghosts should stay buried." He began dragging her toward the breach in the wall, toward the darkness beyond where his ritual altar waited. Ravina fought, but her strength was nothing against his corrupted power. The mark on her hand flickered, fading, as if even Queen Lyra's essence knew this was the end. Then the temperature dropped so suddenly that frost crystallized on every surface. Thalric stood at the far end of the corridor, his white hair lifting in a wind that came from nowhere, his crimson eyes blazing with a fury that had been 5 centuries in the making. Power radiated from him in waves that cracked the stone beneath his feet. For half a millennium, he had mourned. He had clung to the past, to the memory of the woman he'd lost. But as he stared at Ravina, this living, breathing woman being dragged toward death, something fundamental shifted in his ancient heart. This was not Lyra's ghost. This was Lyra's gift. Her hope. Her future. "Release her," Thalric said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command, "or I will show you why vampires once ruled this world in blood and terror." Zarkos smiled. "Come and take her, King of Dust." And the citadel erupted into war. The forbidden vault of Ethelred lay beneath the lowest level of the citadel, sealed behind 7 iron doors that had not been opened in 300 years. Each bore warnings carved in the old tongue, words that promised madness and death to any who disturbed what lay within. Thalric tore through them like paper, his rage giving him strength that transcended even his vampiric nature. Behind him, Rames limped forward, one arm hanging useless at his side, his voice hoarse from the battle. "My king, you cannot, this is forbidden for a reason. The Nexus Vitae right will kill you." "Then I die," Thalric said without looking back, his hands already bleeding from where he'd ripped through enchanted metal. "But I will not lose her." Seraphina appeared from the shadows, her face pale beneath a slash of blood across her cheek. She moved to block his path, desperation in her eyes. "She is not Lyra. You know this. She carries the fragment, but she is not your queen. Would you throw away 5 centuries of existence for a mortal girl you've known for 3 days?" Thalric stopped, turned, and the look in his crimson eyes made even the ancient warrior step back. "Lyra shattered her soul to give me a future," he said, his voice quiet but harder than diamonds. "And I have spent 500 years spitting on that gift, drowning in the past while she scattered pieces of herself across time to save me." His hands trembled. "Ravina is not Lyra's ghost. She is Lyra's hope. And I will not fail that hope again." He shoved past them and descended into the vault. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with books bound in materials that should not exist, skin that still breathed, metal that wept, pages inscribed with ink made from distilled nightmares. At the center stood a stone altar stained black with the residue of 1,000 forbidden rituals. Above it, suspended in chains of pure silver, hung the grimoire of Ethelred, its cover pulsing like a beating heart. Thalric pulled it down, ignoring the way the silver burned his flesh. The grimoire opened of its own accord, pages flipping until they stopped on a ritual written in blood that still glistened wet after millennia. The Nexus Vitae rite. The soul binding. To forge an unbreakable connection between 2 souls, one must sacrifice that which they prize most. For an immortal, that price was time itself, centuries of life, decades of power, the very essence that made them eternal. Thalric read the incantation once, committing the terrible words to memory. Then he drew the ceremonial blade from the altar, its edge so sharp it could cut through the fabric between worlds. "Ravina," he whispered her name like a prayer, like a vow. "Hold on." He pressed the blade to his chest, directly over his heart, and began to speak in the language of creation and destruction. The words burned his tongue, each syllable a small death. Blood welled dark and thick, spilling across the altar in patterns that formed symbols of binding, of permanence, of sacrifice willingly given. The vault filled with light, not the cold blue of vampire magic, but something warm and golden and alive. It poured from his chest wound, from his eyes, from his very essence as the ritual consumed what he was offering. His immortality. His centuries. His endless time. The pain was transcendent. He felt his body beginning to change, felt the weight of 500 years settling into his bones like lead. His white hair dimmed slightly. Lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. His hands, which had been unmarked by age since his transformation, showed the faintest trace of veins beneath pale skin. But through the agony, something else bloomed. A connection, silver and unbreakable, threading from his soul outward across impossible distance. He could feel Ravina, her terror, her pain, the frantic beating of her mortal heart as she was dragged through darkness toward the Cabal's stronghold. And he could feel exactly where she was. The ritual reached its crescendo. Thalric threw his head back and roared as the final price was extracted, as centuries of accumulated power condensed into a single, focused purpose. The grimoire exploded into ash. The altar cracked down the center. And when Thalric finally opened his eyes, they blazed with something that hadn't existed in them for half a millennium. Purpose. Absolute and unshakable. He looked different now, still powerful, still vampire, but no longer the ageless statue he had been. He appeared perhaps 40 human years, threads of darkness beginning to show in his white hair, mortality's shadow finally touching him after so long. But the bond thrummed in his chest like a second heartbeat, pointing north and east toward the Blackstone Mountains where the Cabal's fortress crouched like a cancer on the landscape. Rames and Seraphina stood in the vault's entrance, staring at their transformed king with something approaching awe. "Gather whoever can still fight," Thalric commanded, his voice rougher now, more human. "We ride for the Blackstone Fortress." "My king," Rames said quietly, "that's a death trap. They'll be waiting." Thalric smiled, and it was a terrible thing, part vampire, part man, wholly committed to the impossible. "Good," he said. "I'm done waiting." The Blackstone Fortress clung to the mountain like a diseased growth, its towers built from stones so dark they seemed to devour light itself. Thalric rode through its shattered gates alone, leaving Rames and Seraphina to engage the Cabal forces swarming the outer walls. He had no time for strategy, no patience for caution. The bond in his chest pulled him forward with the inexorable force of destiny, and he followed it through corridors slick with blood and shadow. He found her in the heart of the fortress, in a ritual chamber carved from living rock. Ravina hung suspended above a massive altar, her arms spread wide and bound by chains that glowed with sickly green light. Blood ran from dozens of shallow cuts across her skin, pooling in channels carved into the stone below, feeding the circle of runes that pulsed with stolen power. Her head lolled forward, her dark hair matting to her face, her breathing shallow and erratic. Above her stood Commander Zarkos, his scarred hands raised toward the heavens, chanting in a language that predated human civilization. Dark energies spiraled upward from the altar, wrapping around Ravina like hungry serpents, reaching for the soul fragment that blazed weakly beneath her skin. "Stop." Thalric's voice cracked like thunder through the chamber. Zarkos turned, his void-black eyes gleaming with triumph. The grieving king arrives just in time to watch her die. How poetic." He gestured, and the ritual's pace quickened, the energy tearing at Ravina's essence with visible violence. "Did you really think you could save her? You, who couldn't even save your queen?" The words were designed to wound, and they struck true. But Thalric was done being paralyzed by grief. He moved with speed that blurred reality, crossing the distance in a heartbeat, his blade aimed for Zarkos' heart. But the commander was ready. He raised one hand and spoke a word of unmaking, and the air itself became a weapon. The invisible force struck Thalric mid-stride, slamming him backward into the stone wall with enough power to crack his ribs and drive the breath from his lungs. Zarkos smiled. "You're weaker now, aren't you? I can smell the mortality on you." The great King Thalric reduced to something almost human. Pathetic. He thrust his hand forward, and black lightning erupted from his palm, striking Thalric square in the chest. The pain was unlike anything he'd experienced in 5 centuries, not just physical, but soul-deep, targeting the very essence of what he was. The lightning burrowed into the Nexus Vitae bond, trying to sever it, to destroy the connection he'd sacrificed everything to forge. Thalric screamed, collapsing to his knees as his vision blurred red and black. Through the haze of agony, he heard Ravina's voice, weak but defiant. "Thalric." His eyes found hers across the chamber. She was dying, he could see that clearly. The ritual was consuming her from the inside out, pulling Lyra's fragment free strand by strand. But she was looking at him with something that transcended fear. She was reaching for him. Her marked hand, still bound by chains, stretched toward him as far as the bonds would allow. And the mark blazed like a star going nova. The Nexus Vitae bond, damaged and straining, suddenly ignited. Power exploded through Thalric's chest, not just his ancient vampiric strength, but something infinitely greater. Ravina's mortal will, fierce and unconquerable despite her broken body. The soul fragment's divine essence, awakened by her courage. And binding it all together, the bond forged from his sacrifice, now completing its true purpose. They were one. Thalric rose, his wounds healing instantaneously, his body wreathed in silver-white light that made Zarkos stumble backward in shock. He raised his hand and Ravina's chains shattered like glass. She fell, but didn't strike the altar. Instead, she floated, suspended in the light as their merged power lifted her gently. "No," Zarkos snarled, summoning more dark magic, pouring everything into one final, devastating attack. "You cannot." Ravina and Thalric moved as one, their hands meeting across the space between them. The moment their fingers touched, the world went white. The blast wave that erupted from their joined souls was beyond description. It was pure creation and destruction intertwined, mortal determination and immortal strength unified, love given form and purpose. It swept through the chamber like the wrath of forgotten gods, disintegrating Zarkos mid-scream, reducing his corrupted flesh to less than ash. The Blood Oath curse, that ancient binding that had poisoned Thalric for centuries, shattered like crystal in the face of their combined will. The pieces dissolved into nothingness, finally, permanently unmade. The fortress itself began to collapse, its foundations undermined by the ritual's sudden termination. Stone rained from above as the mountain groaned in protest. Thalric caught Ravina as she fell, cradling her against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with something approaching wonder. "You came," she whispered. "Always," he answered, and ran. They emerged from the fortress moments before it imploded, the entire structure folding in on itself like a dying star. Behind them, the Crimson Cabal scattered like shadows before dawn, their leadership destroyed, their purpose shattered. Thalric collapsed to his knees in the snow, Ravina still held safe in his arms, both of them battered and bleeding and impossibly, miraculously alive. 3 nights after the fortress fell, Thalric returned to Shadowmere Cemetery with Ravina at his side. The ancient gloom still clung to the air, but somehow it felt different now, less oppressive, more like a gentle remembrance than a suffocating shroud. The mist curled around their feet as they walked the familiar path through skeletal trees and weathered angels, their steps in perfect synchronization, their hands clasped together. Thalric looked different in the moonlight. The threads of darkness in his white hair had spread, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened. He moved with the same predatory grace, but there was weight to him now, the weight of mortality gradually reclaiming what had been held at bay for 5 centuries. He appeared a man in his late 30s, powerful and vital, but undeniably, irrevocably aging. He had never looked more alive. They stopped before Queen Lyra's memorial crypt, that towering monument of black marble and silver veins. The gargoyles still crouched at its corners, but their eternal screams seemed softer somehow, as if even stone could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the world. Thalric released Ravina's hand and stepped forward alone, pressing his palm against the cold marble. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his head bowed, his shoulders carrying the weight of half a millennium of grief finally, willingly, being set down. "Lyra," he said quietly, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I understand now. Finally, after all these years, I understand what you tried to give me." The wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying the scent of midnight blossoms. "You didn't shatter your soul so I could spend eternity mourning you. You did it so I could live, truly live, beyond the prison of my grief." His voice cracked, just slightly. "You loved me enough to make sure I would have a future, even if you couldn't be part of it. And he drew a shaking breath, I dishonored that sacrifice by refusing to move forward." Tears tracked down his face, glinting silver in the moonlight. But they were different from the tears he'd shed for 500 years. These were not tears of despair, but of gratitude, of release, of finally letting go. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you gave, for everything you were, and for the extraordinary gift you left me." He turned back to Ravina, who stood watching him with tears streaming down her own cheeks. The mark on her hand glowed softly, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, Lyra's fragment, finally at peace within the woman who carried it. Thalric crossed to her in 3 strides and took both her hands in his. In the moonlight, they looked almost mortal together, 2 people scarred by impossibility, bound by sacrifice, choosing each other despite everything the world had thrown against them. "Ravina," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like a vow, like the first word of a new story being written. "You are not Lyra's ghost. You are not a replacement or a second chance or a fragment to be preserved." His crimson eyes blazed with certainty. "You are living, vibrant, and beautifully complex. You are brave beyond measure and kind beyond reason. You are the future Lyra wanted for me, and you are the present I choose for myself." He sank to one knee before her, there in the shadow of his dead queen's tomb, and the symbolism was not lost on either of them. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because of what you carry, but because of who you are. Will you accept my heart? Will you accept my crown? Will you stand beside me as we build something new from the ashes of what was lost?" Ravina's answer came not in words, but in action. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him with a fierceness that spoke of survival and choice and hard-won hope. When they finally parted, both were breathless, both were smiling through their tears. "Yes," she said. "To all of it. Yes." 2 days later, in the great hall of the citadel before the assembled court, King Thalric Nightfall, visibly aged, visibly mortal, visibly transformed, placed a crown of silver and midnight blooms upon Ravina's head. Lord Rames and Lady Seraphina, both still healing from the battle, but standing proud, knelt first in acknowledgement of their new queen. The rest of the court followed. Ravina stood tall, no longer the desperate, grieving girl who had knelt at a tomb she shouldn't have known. She was empowered, at peace with the fragment she carried and the woman she had become. She met the eyes of vampires and mortals alike with quiet strength, her marked hand resting in Thalric's scarred one. "We begin again," Thalric announced, his voice carrying through the hall. "Not bound by the past, but guided by it. Not defined by loss, but strengthened by what we choose to build." As the court erupted in acknowledgement, Thalric and Ravina turned toward the massive windows overlooking the kingdom, a realm that had dwelt in shadow for too long, now ready for the dawn. Hand in hand, they walked forward. Not toward a destiny written by prophecy or curse, but toward one being written moment by moment in choice, in courage, and in the truest love either had ever known. Behind them, unseen but felt, Queen Lyra's sacrifice finally found its purpose fulfilled. What an ending! If you loved this story, please encourage us by subscribing and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.